Black CEO mocked by white billionaire family. 10 minutes later, she obliterates a $4.9 billion deal. Hello everyone, before we begin today's video, I need your help. We've noticed that the channel is losing traction, and subscribing is one of the best ways you can help us. It's quick, free, and allows us to continue bringing you great content. Your support means everything. Let's keep this channel growing collectively. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. Thank you very much. Now, let's get back to the story. Get out. Now. People like you don't belong in rooms like this. The words were sharp, public, and intentional, thrown like glass across marble. They landed in the center of the ballroom and split the night in two. Crystal chandeliers hovered overhead, their gold light washing over tuxedos and silk gowns, over old money smiles and inherited confidence. The charity gala had been flawless until that moment. Laughter had flowed easily. Champagne had been endless. Power had congratulated itself in low, satisfied tones. Then the room went still. At the center stood Ava Monroe, tall, composed, wearing a simple ivory gown that didn't ask for attention and didn't need permission. Her posture was straight. Her hands were relaxed at her sides. She didn't look startled. She didn't look offended. Across from her, the Whitmore heiress leaned forward in a red satin dress, finger extended like a verdict. Her mouth was still open, the last syllable of now hanging in the air. Around her wrist, diamonds caught the chandelier light like frozen tears. A murmur rippled through the guests, soft, nervous, complicit. Heads turned. Chairs angled. 100 micro-decisions were made in an instant: watch, record, or pretend not to see. Phones rose. Not to intervene. To capture. The father, silver-haired and self-assured, smiled thinly as if this were a necessary correction. Security, he added calmly, we can't have mistakes disrupting the evening. Mistakes. The word drifted toward Ava and stopped just short of touching her. She looked around the room, not searching for allies, not asking for mercy, simply observing. Marble columns. Linen-draped tables. Faces she recognized from boardrooms and headlines. People who controlled markets. People who signed laws. People who had decided, silently, that humiliation was easier than courage. Ava met the heiress's eyes. There was no anger there. No plea. Only assessment. Before we continue, where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. And if you believe in dignity and justice, hit like and subscribe. These stories spark change. And we're glad you're here. Now, back to Ava. The heiress scoffed, mistaking the silence for weakness. Don't stand there like you're confused, she said, loud enough for the microphones at the press table to catch. This is a private event. Invitation only. I don't know how you slipped in, but you're done. A few guests laughed. Not loudly. Just enough. Ava inhaled once. Slowly. Deliberately. I was invited, she said, her voice even, unraised. The father chuckled. By whom? Ava didn't answer him. She didn't need to. She reached into the small clutch at her side and withdrew her phone. No flourish. No announcement. Just a quiet motion that somehow pulled the room tighter around itself. The heiress rolled her eyes. Oh, please. You think pulling out a phone makes you powerful? Ava glanced down at the screen. One message window. One line of text. No emojis. No explanation. Cancel everything. Effective immediately. Her thumb hovered for half a second, then tapped send. Nothing changed right away. The chandeliers still glowed. The orchestra resumed its uncertain melody. Waiters continued to move, careful not to look directly at the confrontation. The Whitmores relaxed, convinced they'd won. The heir smiled, satisfied, already turning away as if Ava were fading furniture. But the air had shifted. A man near the back checked his phone and frowned. A woman at the donor table stopped mid-sip. Somewhere behind the stage, a voice rose, sharp, urgent, cut off just as quickly. Ava lifted her gaze. 10 minutes, she said quietly. The heiress laughed. 10 minutes for what? Ava didn't answer. She slipped her phone back into her clutch and took one small step backward, as if giving the room space to breathe. The father frowned now, scanning the crowd. His aide leaned in, whispering something that drained the color from his face. He straightened too quickly, knocking his glass. Red wine spilled across white linen like a warning. Ava watched. Calm. Centered. The heiress noticed the change. "Daddy," she asked, irritation creeping into her voice. He didn't respond. Because somewhere beyond the chandeliers and the marble, beyond the laughter and the cameras, a $4.9 billion deal, the one meant to save their empire, the one this gala was built to celebrate, had just been erased. And the countdown had already begun. The room didn't explode. It hesitated. That was the first sign something was wrong. The Whitmore heiress's laughter rang a little too long, a little too loud, as if volume alone could restore balance. Around her, guests shifted in their seats, the easy confidence of the evening replaced by a thin, uneasy awareness that something invisible had entered the room. Ava Monroe stood exactly where she was. She didn't look at the heiress anymore. Her gaze moved instead across the faces in the crowd: bankers, donors, politicians, executives, people who prided themselves on reading risk before it arrived. Some avoided her eyes. Others studied her openly now, reassessing. A few reached discreetly for their phones, no longer filming but checking. The orchestra's tempo faltered. A violin came in half a beat late. The sound didn't fill the space the way it had before. The father's aide whispered again, this time more urgently. The man's jaw tightened. His hand closed around the stem of his glass until his knuckles went pale. "What is it?" the heiress hissed, annoyed. "Why are you looking at me like that?" He waved her off. Later. But later wasn't cooperating. Across the ballroom, a senior partner from a European bank stepped away from his table, phone pressed tightly to his ear. His face hardened with every step he took. Nearby, a woman from the legal counsel frowned at her screen, then looked up sharply, straight at Ava. Their eyes met. Recognition flickered. The heiress noticed the shift too late. "Why is everyone staring?" she snapped. "This is ridiculous." Ava finally spoke again, her voice low, controlled. "You wanted me out," she said. "I gave you what you asked for." The heiress scoffed. "Don't flatter yourself." But the words lacked their earlier bite. A murmur spread, no longer laughter but confusion, then fear. Chairs scraped softly against marble as people leaned together, whispering in tight clusters. Names were dropped. Numbers. Phrases like liquidity exposure and withdrawal clause floated through the air like smoke. The father straightened, forcing a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, attempting to reclaim the room, "let's not allow a misunderstanding to." His phone buzzed. Once. Then again. He glanced down. His breath caught. For a split second, the mask slipped. Ava saw it. The heiress followed his gaze, peering at the screen. "What is it?" she demanded. "Say something." He didn't answer. He couldn't. Because the message wasn't vague. It wasn't polite. It wasn't negotiable. Merger terminated. All commitments withdrawn. Effective immediately. The heiress laughed again, but this time it cracked. That's not funny. The aide leaned in close, voice trembling. Sir, it's real. Every partner just pulled out. The father's shoulders sagged, just slightly, but enough. Ava took one step forward. Not aggressively. Intentionally. This gala, she said, calm as ever, was supposed to be a celebration. The heiress stared at her, eyes narrowing. Celebration of what? Ava held her gaze. Survival. The word landed heavy. Phones were no longer pointed at Ava. They were pointed at the Whitmores. At the father's ashen face. At the heiress's widening eyes as understanding finally, painfully, set in. You, the heiress whispered. You did this? Ava didn't smile. She didn't gloat. She simply nodded once. Around them, the room had already chosen sides. And the night was far from over. The truth about Ava Monroe didn't arrive with an announcement. It surfaced the way real power always does, quietly, through recognition. A man near the windows lowered his phone slowly, eyes never leaving her. He had seen that posture before. Not at galas. Not on magazine covers. In rooms without chandeliers. Rooms where decisions were made without applause. He leaned toward the woman beside him. That's her, he murmured. Who? She whispered back. The one who doesn't do interviews. Across the ballroom, the whispers multiplied. Ava felt it, not as noise, but as pressure. The room was recalibrating. Replaying every moment from the beginning of the night. The insult. The command. The silence. The text message. They were connecting dots they should have seen sooner. Because Ava Monroe had never needed recognition to operate. She had learned that early. Years ago, she had stood in a much smaller room, no chandeliers, no marble. Just fluorescent lights buzzing above a scratched conference table. She had been the only black woman there. The youngest. The least expected. They hadn't laughed at her then. They had ignored her. The pitch deck she'd built herself sat unopened as men twice her age spoke over her, around her, through her. When she finally spoke, one of them smiled politely and said, "We're looking for someone with more presence." She'd nodded. Thanked them for their time. Walked out without raising her voice. That night, she wrote one sentence in a notebook she still carried with her now. Never argue with people who need to underestimate you to feel safe. She built everything after that sentence. Slowly. Deliberately. Out of sight. While others chased headlines, Ava structured leverage. While they boasted, she acquired. She learned how to disappear behind intermediaries, how to let firms with clean names sign documents she authored. How to let men like Whitmore believe they were negotiating from strength. By the time her name appeared on internal reports, it was usually too late to change anything. Back in the ballroom, the father cleared his throat, trying to recover. There's been a misunderstanding, he said, voice thin. These things can be resolved. Ava looked at him now. Really looked. You built your empire on assumption, she said. That the room would always belong to you. The heiress snapped, panic bleeding through her anger. You don't get to lecture us. You walked in here uninvited. Ava tilted her head slightly. I walked into a building my firm underwrote, she replied. To attend an event partially funded by a foundation I sit on quietly. That landed harder than any insult. A hush fell. Someone near the bar inhaled sharply. A donor stared at his phone, scrolling back through an email thread, color draining from his face as a signature line finally registered. Ava Monroe. The heiress took a step back without realizing she'd moved. That's not possible, she said weakly. It is, Ava replied. And it's done. The father sank into his chair, the weight of decades pressing down all at once. He understood now not just the loss of the deal, but the scope of the mistake. The kind you don't recover from with apologies or favors. Around them, alliances dissolved in real time. A senator excused himself. A fund manager avoided eye contact. A woman who had laughed earlier now stared into her glass as if it might explain how quickly power had shifted hands. Ava felt none of it as triumph. Only clarity. She had come tonight to sign papers. To formalize an agreement she no longer believed in. The humiliation had simply accelerated the inevitable. You see, she said softly, not to the heiress, but to the room, I don't need to belong here. She paused. You needed me. Silence answered her. And for the first time that night, everyone understood exactly who had been standing in front of them all along. The Whitmore family had always believed the room belonged to them. Not because anyone had ever said it out loud, but because no one had ever challenged it. For decades, their name had opened doors before they touched the handle. Their donations bought silence. Their influence rewrote inconvenience into apology. They moved through the world insulated by legacy, protected from consequence by familiarity. Tonight was supposed to be no different. The father sat motionless now, eyes fixed on nothing, replaying numbers in his head like a gambler who already knew the odds had turned. He had spent the last 3 years stitching together illusions, rolling debt into debt, propping up failing assets with borrowed confidence. The $4.9 billion deal wasn't just important. It was oxygen. Without it, the empire collapsed in layers. Real estate holdings leveraged beyond safety. Quiet loans with unforgiving clauses. A balance sheet that looked respectable only if you never pulled too hard at the edges. And now, someone had. The heiress paced, heels clicking sharply against marble. This is absurd, she snapped. You can't just erase something like that. Ava watched her with the calm of someone observing a predictable pattern. I didn't erase it, she said. I withdrew from it. The distinction mattered. The mother finally spoke, her voice tight with a fury sharpened by fear. You embarrassed us, she said. In front of everyone. Ava met her gaze. You embarrassed yourselves, she replied. I just didn't stop you. Around them, the gala continued in fragments. Conversations broke off mid-sentence. People lingered just long enough to understand the danger of proximity. Some smiled too quickly. Others avoided the family entirely, instinctively stepping away from sinking ground. The Whitmores felt it happening. Their circle shrinking. Their relevance recalibrating. A banker who had once laughed at their jokes now checked his watch and excused himself. A longtime donor whispered something to his wife, already calculating the optics of staying. Even the press, sensing a better story, adjusted their lenses not toward Ava anymore, but toward the unraveling dynasty. The heiress stopped pacing. You planned this, she accused. Ava shook her head. I prepared for it. There was a difference. She hadn't walked into the gala intending to humiliate anyone. She had come to finalize terms. To shake hands. to leave quietly, as she always did. But dignity, once violated, demanded response. The father looked up at her then, voice hoarse. "What do you want?" Ava considered the question not because she needed time, but because she wanted him to understand the answer. "I wanted partners who understood respect," she said. "I wanted alignment. Integrity." A pause. "You wanted permission," she continued. "And you thought it was yours to give." The words landed with surgical precision. The heiress scoffed weakly. "You think this makes you powerful?" Ava stepped closer, lowering her voice just enough that only they could hear. "Power isn't what I think," she said. "It's what already moved." She gestured subtly toward the room. The Whitmores followed her gaze and finally saw it. They were alone. Not physically, but structurally. The gala that had begun as their victory lap had become a quiet audit of their relevance. Every smile now was cautious. Every glance was measuring distance. Ava straightened, reclaiming the space without raising her voice. "This isn't personal," she said. "It's procedural." The mother's lips trembled. The father closed his eyes. And the heiress, who had built her identity on never being contradicted, stood frozen, realizing for the first time that status without leverage was just noise. Ava turned slightly, preparing to leave the circle. Behind her, the Whitmore empire continued to collapse slowly, visibly, and entirely by its own design. And the night was about to make that collapse official. The message had already been sent. That was the part no one in the room could change. Ava Monroe stood with her hands relaxed at her sides, posture unbroken, as the consequences of that single tap continued to unfold far beyond the chandeliers and marble. The Whitmores were still speaking, still arguing, still posturing, but their words now belonged to a different reality. One that was already collapsing. The father's phone buzzed again. And again. He didn't answer this time. He didn't need to. He already knew what each vibration meant. Banks returning calls that had once been begged for. Partners suddenly unavailable. Advisors who had promised loyalty now asking for distance. "What's happening?" the heiress demanded, her voice sharp but thin. "Why won't anyone answer?" Ava turned toward her, not unkindly. "Because," she said, "they're updating their risk assessments." The phrase sounded clinical. Harmless. It wasn't. Across the ballroom, the head of a private equity firm slipped out a side door, phone pressed tight to his ear. Near the stage, a legal consultant whispered urgently into a headset, eyes darting toward the Whitmores and then away, as if proximity itself had become dangerous. The orchestra stopped altogether. The silence this time wasn't awkward. It was alert. The father finally stood, adjusting his jacket with a hand that trembled despite his effort to steady it. "Let's speak privately," he said to Ava. "We can resolve this." Ava shook her head once. "There's nothing left to resolve." "You can't be serious," the heiress snapped. "This is billions." 4.9, Ava corrected calmly. "And I'm always serious about what I build." The words didn't echo. They didn't need to. They sank. A few guests who had been hovering nearby drifted farther away, pretending to admire artwork, to check messages, to do anything but remain within reach of a family whose financial gravity had just reversed. Ava noticed it all without reacting. This was the part people misunderstood about power. They expected noise, anger, celebration. What they didn't expect was restraint. She hadn't raised her voice once. The mother spoke now, her composure cracking. "You humiliated us." Ava met her gaze. "You humiliated me," she replied. "In public." A pause. "I responded," Ava continued, "in private. Through systems you trusted until they stopped favoring you." The father swallowed hard. "If this goes through," he said, "we're finished." Ava nodded. "It already has." At that moment, a young assistant approached, pale and breathless, phone in hand. She leaned in, whispering to the father with the urgency of someone delivering bad news to a man who already knew it was coming. The color drained from his face. The heiress watched, eyes wide. What did she say? He didn't answer. He couldn't. Because the final confirmation had arrived. Not just withdrawal. Not just cancellation. A cascade, frozen accounts, suspended negotiations, partners invoking exit clauses they'd never expected to use. The gala had been scheduled to celebrate a future that no longer existed. Ava took a slow breath. Not in relief. In closure. This was avoidable, she said quietly. All of it. The heiress shook her head, voice rising. You think this makes you better than us? Ava looked at her, not with disdain, not with triumph, but with something closer to certainty. No, she said. It makes me accountable. She turned then, stepping away from the Whitmores, toward the edge of the room. Guests parted instinctively, creating a clear path without being asked. Behind her, the family stood frozen, caught between denial and realization. Ahead of her, the night waited. And somewhere beyond the walls of the ballroom, the systems Ava had built were doing exactly what they were designed to do. Finish the job. The collapse didn't announce itself with a single sound. It arrived in layers. At first, it was subtle, too subtle for anyone unfamiliar with how power truly moved. A conversation cut short. A smile that failed to return. A donor who glanced at his watch and decided, suddenly, that he had somewhere else to be. Then it accelerated. Phones buzzed again across the ballroom, no longer in unison, but in waves. Each vibration carried a private reckoning. Advisors reading messages twice. Bankers stepping into corners. Executives lowering their voices as if the walls themselves might be listening. The Whitmores felt the shift like a change in pressure. The father stood rigid, his eyes scanning the room as if counting exits that no longer mattered. He had spent decades learning how to read markets, how to anticipate risk. But this wasn't a market move. This was systemic. Who else knows? The heiress whispered, panic stripping the edge from her voice. The mother answered without looking at her. Everyone who matters. That realization hit harder than the numbers. Across the room, a senior journalist typed rapidly, then paused, rereading the headline forming on her screen. She deleted it. Rewrote it. Changed the angle. The story was no longer about a charity gala. It was about a downfall. Ava Monroe moved through the space with quiet purpose, not toward the exit yet, but through the current she had created. Conversations died as she passed. Not out of fear, but respect. People were recalibrating in real time. A hedge fund manager leaned toward his colleague. Why didn't we know it was her? The colleague shook his head. She never needs to be seen. Near the bar, a politician who had once accepted Whitmore donations cleared his throat and stepped back, careful to be photographed at a distance. Optics mattered. And tonight, the optics were rewriting themselves. The heiress noticed the shift and lashed out, grabbing at what little authority she thought remained. This is ridiculous, she snapped at a group nearby. Nothing's final. Deals change. No one answered her. They didn't need to. Ava paused near the edge of the ballroom, glancing once more at her phone. Messages continued to arrive, not confirmations now, but acknowledgments. Compliance teams. Legal departments. Boards voting without debate. Everything she had set in motion was unfolding exactly as designed. Behind her, the father finally spoke again, his voice barely carrying. You planned contingencies. Ava turned. I plan outcomes. He nodded slowly, the truth settling in. This wasn't personal. That made it worse. The mother sank into a chair, suddenly older, her diamonds dull under the chandelier light. She had built her world on perception, on being seen as untouchable. Tonight had stripped that illusion bare. Guests continued to drift away, one by one, then in clusters. Not dramatically. Quietly. Each departure a signal to the next. The gala thinned, leaving behind only those too stunned or too loyal to leave. Ava finally moved toward the exit. Not hurried. Not triumphant. Measured. As she passed a group of junior executives, one of them caught her eye. Ms. Monroe, he said softly, almost reverently. She stopped. You didn't raise your voice, he added, more to himself than to her. Ava offered a faint nod. I didn't need to. She continued on. Behind her, the Whitmore family stood amid the wreckage of an evening that was supposed to save them. Their empire hadn't fallen with a crash. It had been withdrawn. And the room, once theirs by default, had already chosen who would carry its respect forward. The doors closed softly behind Ava. Inside, the consequences kept moving. The announcement didn't come with a microphone. It didn't need one. It arrived the way irreversible truths always do, through confirmation. A senior partner from the bank stepped into the center of the room, phone still in hand, his expression caught between disbelief and obligation. He cleared his throat once, drawing just enough attention to fracture the remaining conversations. It's confirmed, he said quietly. The Whitmore merger has been terminated. All related capital commitments have been withdrawn. The words rippled outward, faster than sound. A gasp. Then another. Then silence. The heiress turned slowly, her face draining of color. You can't just say that, she snapped. This is a private event. The man didn't look at her. He looked at Ava. Ava met his gaze and gave a small, precise nod. That was all. The father staggered back a step, steadying himself against the table. This is a mistake, he said, though his voice no longer believed it. We were celebrating tonight. Yes, Ava replied evenly. You were. The room absorbed the distinction. Phones came out again, but this time, no one was recording Ava. They were recording the Whitmores. The frozen expressions. The collapse in real time. The moment when legacy failed to protect itself. A reporter whispered urgently into her mic. A cameraman reframed his shot. Somewhere near the bar, someone murmured, "This is going to be everywhere by morning." The heiress spun toward Ava, fury and panic colliding. You did this to punish us. Ava shook her head. I did this to protect myself. A pause. And my people, she added. The father looked up then, finally understanding the full scope of the loss, not just money, but position. Access. Influence. The invisible safety net that had cushioned every failure before tonight. "What happens now?" he asked quietly. Ava considered him for a moment. "Now," she said, "you learn what it feels like to be uninvited." The line cut clean. Around them, the room shifted one last time. People who had once leaned in now leaned away. Alliances recalculated. Invitations silently revoked. The Whitmores stood at the center of a space that no longer responded to them. Ava reached for her coat, accepting it from an attendant who suddenly treated her with unmistakable deference. She didn't look back as she slipped it on. "This isn't over," the heiress said weakly. Ava paused at the doorway and glanced back once, not with threat, not with satisfaction. With finality. "It is," she said. "For me." She stepped through the doors. Inside, the gala dissolved into fragments of shock and regret. Outside, Ava Monroe walked into the night unchanged, unshaken, leaving behind a room that would spend years trying to understand how power had passed through it so quietly, and failed to recognize itself until it was gone. The ballroom didn't empty all at once. It rearranged. People didn't rush for the exits. That would have looked like panic. Instead, they drifted one conversation at a time, creating distance with practiced elegance. A donor excused himself for an early flight. A board member remembered a prior commitment. A photographer lowered his camera and pretended to check the lens. The Whitmores remained where they were. Not because they wanted to, but because they had nowhere to move that still answered to them. The heiress stood rigid, her confidence unraveling thread by thread. She watched as a woman she'd known for years turned her back mid-sentence. As a man who had once laughed too loudly at her jokes offered a stiff nod and disappeared into the crowd. "Say something," she whispered to her father. He didn't. He was staring at the floor now, as if the marble might explain how quickly gravity had changed. Across the room, Ava Monroe's absence was louder than any announcement. The space she'd occupied held its shape, a quiet reminder of who had passed through and what had shifted with her. People spoke her name softly now. Not as gossip. As reference. She underwrote the North expansion. That was her firm. No, she never puts her face on it. Each sentence corrected a past assumption. Each correction widened the gap between what the room had believed and what it now knew. The mother finally rose from her chair, smoothing her dress with hands that trembled despite her effort to control them. "We should leave," she said, voice brittle. The heiress snapped her head around. "Leave? This is our event." The mother didn't argue. She didn't have to. The father took a step forward, then stopped. For the first time in his life, the instinct that had always guided him, stay, assert, negotiate, offered no solution. There was no leverage left to pull. Around them, staff members moved with a new caution. Attendants who had once hovered now avoided eye contact. Security stood straighter, awaiting instructions that would never come. The room had decided. Outside, the night was cold and clear. Ava stood beneath the glow of the porte-cochere lights, breathing in air that felt lighter than the gilded atmosphere she'd left behind. Her driver opened the door without a word. She paused, not to look back, but to listen. The muffled sound of the gala seeped through the doors. Voices overlapping. Confusion finding language. A legacy beginning its slow retreat from relevance. Ava stepped into the car. As it pulled away, messages continued to arrive on her phone, not requests, not apologies, but acknowledgments. Confirmation that systems had settled into their new configuration. That what needed to end had ended. She set the phone face down. Inside the ballroom, the Whitmores stood amid the residue of their own certainty, surrounded by a crowd that had already moved on. The chandeliers still sparkled. The music attempted to resume. But the room would never feel the same. Because power had passed through it without permission. And everyone left behind knew exactly who they would remember when the lights finally dimmed. By morning, the city would have a new story. But tonight, Ava Monroe allowed herself a moment of quiet before it arrived. The car moved smoothly through the sleeping streets, glass towers sliding past like reflections of choices already made. She watched the lights without thinking about them, her mind finally free of the room she'd left behind. The gala would continue without her for a while. There would be speeches shortened. Music resumed too late. Guests pretending the evening had merely shifted rather than ended. The Whitmores would smile stiffly, attempting to regain footing in a world that had already recalculated their weight. But systems didn't care about smiles. By dawn, the consequences would be public. Financial outlets would frame it carefully at first: strategic withdrawal, unexpected restructuring. Analysts would speculate. Commentators would circle the edges of a truth they didn't yet fully grasp. And then the deeper reporting would begin. The buried debt. The over-leveraged assets. The deals propped up by reputation alone. The Whitmore name would survive, technically. Names often did. But its meaning would change. Invitations would thin. Calls would go unanswered. Influence would become conditional. Ava had seen it happen before. Not to them, but to others who had mistaken access for immunity. Her phone vibrated once more. She ignored it. Some victories didn't require witnesses. The car slowed at a red light. Ava caught her reflection in the window, still composed, still grounded. The same woman who had walked into the ballroom hours earlier. The same woman who had been told, publicly, to leave. She hadn't raised her voice. She hadn't defended herself. She hadn't asked to be understood. She had simply chosen not to stay small. That was the part people always misunderstood. They believed dignity was passive. That restraint meant surrender. They were wrong. Dignity was a decision. The car turned onto a quieter street. Ava thought briefly of her grandmother, of the woman who had taught her that power didn't announce itself, and that respect, once lost, was almost impossible to recover. She hoped the Whitmores would learn that lesson eventually. But learning wasn't her responsibility. The car came to a stop. Ava stepped out, the night air cool against her skin. She stood for a moment, listening to the quiet hum of the city settling into its own rhythms. Somewhere behind her, a dynasty was unraveling. Somewhere ahead, work awaited. Ava walked forward. She didn't look back. Because the truth was simple, and it had never changed. You don't need to shout when your position speaks for you. You don't need permission when you hold consequence. And you don't need to belong in a room to decide its outcome. The door closed softly behind her. The night moved on. So did she.